Hi, this is Possibilities. My name is Cecil Walker,
And I am Adam Frower.
and today we're going to be chatting about how to deal with anxiety and how to find belief in the midst of that anxiety. I think the first question that comes to anyone who hears a title like that is, what does anxiety have to do with belief? Why do I need belief if I'm feeling like I'm dealing with anxiety?
Good question. Yeah, so I'll do my best. I'm sure you can add in. But I think one of the things that as we have kind of worked with many people who have been dealing with anxiety, one of the things that seems really consistent across each of those cases is that oftentimes what happens is when people are feeling anxious, it becomes kind of this all-consuming experience where the anxiety, I guess I'm going to use the word kind of stills your mental space, right? And it becomes, I can only think about the present experience of feeling this way or being worried about this particular thing or whatever it is. And so 100% of my energy and attention is dedicated to that. And so then the insight, kind of as we've been thinking about it and talking about it, is there's kind of this moment where when people start to get their feet underneath them again, and when people feel like, okay, I'm starting to begin to deal with this anxiety or make this anxiety feel more manageable, there's kind of this like moment of pivot. And one of the things that we've started to notice or think about or talk about is this moment of pivot. That's a moment where belief kind of kicks in, where there's this understanding or this, I've put kind of my faith to think something could be different. That I start to see, I think the way that you described it one time was like, there could be a way out of this. And so I think that we kind of want to talk about that pivot moment of from being completely consumed to seeing that there is a possibility of some experience that's different than this experience.
Yeah. It's, I think there are a lot of synonyms that are nearly identical to anxiety. I can think of words like fear, and doubt, all these things that are obviously quite negative. But when I think of those words as being potential synonyms for anxiety, it makes a lot of sense why belief is the thing that actually, I don't know if cure is the word, but belief gives relief to those things. Belief could bring me out of self-doubt. Belief could bring me out of kind of drowning in fear. And so I think that's a bit more intuitive when you start to use words like faith and belief and seeing your way out of this, pivoting away from those things. The experiences that you have, the conversations that you have, the things that you hear or start to think that could guide you towards belief or having faith or seeing a way out, that kind of stuff is a breath of fresh air to someone who's been in a place of fear for a really long time. So it is a really comprehensive thing. I just think that the initial glance at anxiety and belief, I don't know if those things always go together.
Yeah, I think that's true. And one of the things that I think that we've talked a lot about too is kind of the neuroscience or even the emotional experience, right? Oftentimes when people are feeling what we typically call negative emotion, things that you just mentioned, fear, doubt, worry, sadness, those kinds of things, they become kind of the focal point, and it becomes this narrowing experience where it becomes this all-consuming experience. On the other hand, when you experience positive emotions, things like happiness, excitement, joy, it becomes this self-fulfilling upward spiral, that the more that I feel those things, the more I want to feel those things, and I move in that direction. And so I think that understanding kind of the neuroscience and that emotional experience, that also kind of highlights the importance of using that word of belief. When I'm feeling negative experience, my belief in anything other than this kind of diminishes. I have this narrow focus. On the other hand, when I start to feel something that's positive, opportunities, possibilities begin to expand. I can see that there are other things out there than just this one experience.
Yeah, you describe it really, really well. As you know, I have recently started having to deal with sudden, kind of onset anxiety, moments of anxiety. And it feels very much like there is this part of you that you're having to console, almost this part of you that you're having to deal with, almost like an infant that you have to take care of, where things that are unfamiliar or uncertain, things that are scary, things that are whatever, falling on this negative side can really aggravate that part of yourself. But things that are a bit more soothing, things that are, like you're describing, kind of inspire these positive emotions. Obviously, something infantile like that, something reactive like that, is going to respond in a way that actually you can start to feel a bit of a sense of relief, a bit of a sense of maybe even gratitude. And so the other thing that you also described is like the possibilities opening up. And I can very much see how when you're in that spiral in the other direction, when you're in the negative spiral, it's stealing all of your potential for seeing the possibilities. It's stealing all the ways that you might be able to say, here's how I can deal with this situation, or here's how I can kind of predict I'm going to make my way out of this, or here's how I can even just kind of quietly kind of console myself and feel like I can tell myself things might be okay. It steals that away and kind of removes any room that you have for saying those kinds of things to yourself. But when you're on that pivot, as you said, when you're coming back around from that low point, and you start to get more and more of that sense of there are ways out of this. Here are things I can think about myself as I'm dealing with this. Here are things I can think about my situation. And that positive emotion, I feel like, can get easily dismissed as that's just like feeling good for the moment or something, or the things that people might say about a solution-focused session, that it's just these are just nice feelings, these are just nice conversations. But really what it is, and what it very much feels like in the moment, is it's like poking holes in this thing that had you kind of trapped and down. It starts to feel like there's light out there, there's ways out of this, there's something that's I can start to grasp onto. And then that's just the beginning of that upward spiral, like you said. Once you get more and more of that, it makes even more of it possible.
Yeah, you made me think of a question. And the question, I think many people who listen to this or watch this might say, so we entitled this like how to, right? So how do you do this? How do you kind of make that pivot?
Yeah.
And so as you think about that, you said a couple of things I think are important. Oftentimes when you're kind of on that downward spiral, it feels like you're saying this is going to be the permanent state, right? Like, or I worry that what if this never goes away? What if I never feel anything but this? But on the other hand, when you get those like moments of light or change in positive emotion or whatever, then kind of the thought process that's involved there is, oh, this is just a temporary reprieve, but that permanent state will come back. So when you think about kind of making that pivot, moving to a belief in maybe this isn't a temporary state, or maybe these positive experiences that I'm having could outweigh that kind of negative experience or that thing that I thought was the positive state. How do you make that turn? What are some things that help to kind of put the belief in those positive moments and start disbelieving this permanency?
If we think of anxiety as worry, I could very well translate worry as being a certain type of belief. In fact, it's just a belief that things aren't looking too good, that things are heading in a bad direction or are stuck in a bad direction, or that there is something that is very, very concerning that I should feel bad about. And so when things start to swing in a different direction, And you get some of that belief that you're talking about that actually starts to bring you out of this. I feel like it's a turning of what you're believing. It's a turning of what you're spending those assumption efforts on. And because anxiety is so fueled by your own thoughts and your own beliefs, if we're going to go with that word, whatever you're feeding on, whatever beliefs you're holding on to, I feel like that's what determines how big or small this anxiety is. And so if you're believing in the things that the anxiety is saying, like you're in a really, really bad situation, you're going to be stuck in this situation, it's going to get worse. Maybe even you're too small to handle this situation. Whatever that it might try to make you believe. If you start to turn and believe some of these other things that we're saying are on this other side, like you've dealt with hard things before, even if you feel bad while you deal with that, you can still move towards something good. You can still get things done as you feel bad, and eventually start to feel better. Or you're not alone as you deal with that. Lots of people deal with this. There are people who can help you that you know personally that are potentially deal with this or know how to deal with this. So I don't know if this entirely answers your question, and you can turn me back around to get more of your question. But when I think of this as what you believe in, it starts to become quite easy how just pivoting over here can really start to diminish that anxiety and even come out with more than I went in with in the first place, to actually start to feel like I can find gratitude and appreciation and a sense of knowing myself better on the way out of this thing.
Yeah, what I think is really valuable, a lot of what you were talking about was connected to this idea of bigness or smallness, right? On the way down the spiral, worry and anxiety and fear and all of doubt, all of those things, they become bigger. They take up more space in my consciousness, in my awareness. So those things enlarge. And in some sense, I think that is, in what you answered, that's the very answer for how do I make this pivot, is I start to make other things bigger. I start spending my time doing things that I enjoy doing, or that will help me find peace or calm, right? So then that peace gets bigger. I go associate with people who I enjoy, who can help distract me potentially, or who can help me remember the things that I did to cope. And so that my network gets bigger, or who I'm relying on changes from I'm just relying on myself to manage or deal with this, to now I'm managing with the help of other people. Remembering, I think, that we have control over the size. If I notice that some things are getting bigger that I don't want to be big, then I purposely, instead of putting my effort into making that smaller, I put my energy and effort into making other things big. And then just by sheer geometry, those other things can't stay big because there's not enough room for both of these things to be big.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, that fits the experience of it so well. But I think that also captures a bit of the irony in there too, is because when you're feeling the physiology of the anxiety, and when your head is being commandeered by the thoughts of anxiety, it feels like this is the only thing that can fit. This is so big that nothing else can fit, and it won't even let you try to spend energy on getting around it or figuring something else out. But it's those tiny little bubbles of these other things, when those sneak in and just show you that something else is possible, and then you start feeding those more and they grow bigger as you're describing. It's automatic that this anxiety thing shrinks, and that it gets a bit smaller. So I think that description is perfect.
So I guess in the last description that you just also said, it's like these tiny little bubbles of other things come in. What if we're talking about like how to manage this, right? So this little tiny bubble of how do I nurture that bubble in a moment where I feel like maybe it's not worth it, maybe I don't have the energy or the strength. How do I help that bubble grow a bit?
I have so many different angles of answers to that, and I think all of these perspectives in my answer to that fall under just the understanding that it can get better. So that's the blanket statement I would say to that. Somehow reaching out and getting into contact with the idea that it can get better is the antidote. And this, like I said, there's different angles to that. On the one side, there's just the pure physiology of it. You can do things that help with how it makes your body feel. For me, it was lots of nausea and feeling sick and not being able to eat and not being able to really feel comfortable in my stomach. And there's things you can do for that. For me, being active was helpful to settle my stomach. So walking and running, sometimes like a ginger tea or a ginger supplement, something to just settle the stomach a bit is helpful with that. Getting a good night's sleep definitely was really, really helpful with lots of physiological things. For some people, I know they get headaches or they get like body pain, and stretching helps with that, or taking a calm moment to like meditate or just focus on your breathing just to kind of relax your muscles a bit can help with that. So on one hand, there's this fraction of this idea that it can get better, and the better there is just how your body feels can get better, and there's things you can do with that. I think you can also look at this a more abstract part of the equation where you can move from being in a bad place to a good place, and that idea of it can get better. And so there it's helpful to be able to say, well, I've felt bad before and I got better. And so that might give you one of those little bubbles. Someone else might be able to say, well, I used to feel like that and I did this, or somehow over time I got to this place. That's a little bubble that might help you get in contact with this can get better. And just to be able to see someone else be able to say, it was really, really bad, but then somehow I made my way over here. I did these things, or I thought these things, I came into contact with these things, and I got over here. And I don't know if it sounds obvious just in my describing it, but that suddenly shows you how fragile the anxiety is. And so it says this big, big thing you don't have to be so afraid of, you don't have to feel like is such a looming, threatening thing, because look at how these other things conquered that. Look at how these other things just totally washed that away. And then maybe another third potential angle is that even while you're sitting with this thing in your lap, that doesn't instantly disintegrate you, that doesn't mean you can't function. That doesn't mean your relationships are done and over and not worth putting effort into. That doesn't mean your hobbies are no longer worth putting effort into. It doesn't mean that you can't live while feeling some of those things. I don't know if you knew this, but I don't get sick that often. But when I do get sick, I feel like it shuts everything down for me because I'm just not used to being sick, and it feels like I can't live my normal life when it's like that. But you can definitely do things while you have a cold. Probably best you stay away from people, but you can still, read. You can go for a walk. You can, do all the things that you might normally do on a day, even though you don't feel totally comfortable. And I think that's another thing that kind of introduces you to the idea of it can get better. It's not the black and white of I feel like I'm totally myself and I feel good and everything is fine, or I feel terrible and I can't get anything done and it's all awful. There's plenty of room for you to make your way to the middle ground of I don't feel 100%, but look at how I could still do this. I could do a crossword puzzle. I could go for a walk. I could talk to friends, hang out with friends. I can somehow still get pieces of my life and have those feel like they're functioning and working, even while the anxiety is trying to do its annoying job of oppressing you from feeling like you can do things.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think as you were talking, one of the things that came to my mind is something that we talk about quite often in solution-focused brief therapy, which is there are different versions of me, right? So there is I don't think that we're saying at all like anxiety doesn't exist or that it doesn't have, you know, a significant impact on you. But if we change the language slightly, we can say there is an anxious version of me, or there's a version of me that deals with anxiety. But there are also versions of me where I don't feel anxious. Maybe it's like you mentioned, like I'm doing a hobby, so it's something that I enjoy. I don't feel anxious in that moment of time. Or when I'm associating with my friends or my family or something, then anxiety seems to be a bit less. And so I think part of managing and dealing with the anxiety is to look at which version of you is showing up in a particular moment, and in some sense taking note of what can I learn about how to manage and deal with anxiety from the other versions of myself, right? From the friend version of myself, or from the employee version of myself, or and again, maybe I experience anxiety at work, and so the employee version of myself isn't the version of myself that I want to tap into. But I think one of the things that we can know, again, and I think it goes back to that, sometimes we view anxiety as a permanent, static state. And I think that when we start to notice there are nuances, there are moments where I feel more or less anxious, I can start to learn when I feel less anxious, what's happening? What do I do? How do I manage that? When I move from a high anxiety state and I start to experience a little bit of reprieve, what helped me tip that scale, right? So I think as we think about it as less as of a static state and more of something that comes and goes, it ebbs and flows, it fluctuates, we can also then, inherent in that is, I have an impact on the ebbs and flows. I have some control over how much energy or attention I give to it versus how much energy or attention I'm giving to something else. That perspective allows us to then learn, even in the midst of dealing with the anxiety. I learn, maybe each time I have a new worry come up, or I have a new anxious episode or whatever, I learn what contributed to this coming on, what helped me to get out of it. And so I think taking some stock along the roller coaster to say, when it's happening, what else is happening?
I think there's so many brilliant parts to what you just described. There is just this automatic tendency when you're feeling anxious, when anxiety is on top of you and inside of you, to do anxious things. That just automatically makes sense, right? We wouldn't even question it or think too much about it if we weren't that aware about it. When you're feeling anxious, you avoid things that might make anxiety worse. You stay home. You don't try to do anything too stimulating. You maybe even cross off some of your responsibilities or some of your engagements that you had planned. You try to seclude yourself and do all the things that the anxiety is saying that you should do. It says, that's a problem, worry about that, so move away from that. But that's the kind of stuff that makes anxiety worse. It's really actually strange how anxiety makes you do all these things almost out of sense of concern and worry, but that stuff makes you feel worse and makes the anxiety even worse. But when you describe saying, what do I do when I'm not anxious? What do I do when I'm actually feeling pretty good? When I don't have self-doubt? When my mind is really busy and I'm feeling good about the things that I'm doing? All of that kind of stuff could very easily pull you out of anxiety. Like we said, if anxiety is something that runs on a belief in worry and self-doubt and concern, to pull that belief away and to suddenly find yourself doing things that say, I believe I'm a strong person. I believe I'm a good friend. I believe I'm someone who values intellectual engagement. When you start to do these things that pull you into these other versions of yourself, I'd like to think you only have a finite amount of belief, right? You can't spend it on everything all at once. So when you divest it from the anxiety and spend it on these other versions of yourself, it starts to really make a difference. If I am feeling very anxious, but I go for a 5-mile run, I think that really tells myself and tells the anxiety, well, here's what I believe about myself. Here's what I believe about the situation that I'm in.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, as you were talking to, that came to my mind is we can also be thoughtful in particularly not anxious moments,
Mm-hmm.
right? About thinking about imagining, about designing even what kind of person I want to be, and rehearsing that and giving that a lot of time and energy and attention.
Mm-hmm.
The more I put my energy into becoming the kind of person or the version of myself that I want to be, then in moments where that anxiety maybe comes into play, I have something to hold on to, and I say, okay, but overall, I'm aiming to become this kind of person, or I'm trying to pursue this, or I want to achieve that. And so that designed version of myself could actually even be a coping mechanism in a moment where I don't feel like I have the ability to aim at that yet. I can just say, but I'm holding on to the belief that I could, and that this moment is a temporary moment in my pursuit of becoming that thing.
I could even see that playing an active role in those kinds of hard moments. It's just like if you say, I want to be an honest person. Usually people who dedicate themselves to honesty, that's a beforehand thing, right? At some point you're valuing honesty. Honesty is a good thing. Someone taught me that. Some experience taught me that. And the moments where the challenge is going to come up, where you're going to have to decide to be honest, are ahead of you now.
Yeah.
And in those moments, you have to go and say, well, I did say honesty is important to me. So now what do? I have to do something that lets me get closer to being an honest version of myself rather than a more dishonest version of myself. And so in that moment, that design that you said from before is playing a very active role. And so any of these things that you might say you want to attain or be, or some version of yourself you want to step into, when these anxious moments come up, when these self-doubtful moments come up, when these moments of worry come up, being able to say, well, I did kind of dedicate myself to being someone who keeps going through hard things. I did dedicate myself to someone who is able to pursue some greater good, even though there are obstacles in the way. I dedicated myself to just being a resilient person. Anything that you might have tried to tack onto yourself or say, I really value that thing and I want that thing. I think that could play a very active role when you find yourself in any kind of low moment, but we're specifically talking about anxious moments.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably all the time we have, but thank you for, explaining your own experience.
Yeah.
I know sometimes people are nervous about saying, telling your own experiences, but I think we've highlighted some really, really valuable things about belief, and how designing what you want to believe in,
Right.
about turning to that various beliefs as you're walking through this process, about letting those bubbles grow a little bit bigger. There's kind of layers of belief that come into this play, and I think that's one of the things that we're hoping that we can convey to each of you. So thank you for being here. Please let us know what your thoughts are about this conversation about dealing with anxiety. If you have additional tips or things that you think might be helpful, please put those in the comments. Share this with people you think could benefit from hearing about this kind of a conversation. And we'll catch you next time.